My name is Nadia Osei, and I was 30 for the night my business partner handed me a buyout check at the launch party for the company I had built from a folding table in my spare bedroom. She smiled when she passed it across the bar top. The envelope was cream-colored, thick stock, the kind you use when you want the bad news to feel considered. Marcus, her husband and our firm's new legal counsel, stood one step behind her with the expression of a man who had rehearsed, not looking guilty, and hadn't quite landed it. I didn't open the envelope. I set it beside my champagne flute and looked at the room. 300 people. My clients, my vendors, my contractors. The journalist from the Business Journal, who had driven 2 hours for this. The catering staff I had personally interviewed because the details of a room have always mattered to me more than the room knows. I looked at the room, and I said nothing. Because here is what Celeste did not know, what Marcus with his rehearsed face did not know, and what neither of them had thought to find out before choosing tonight to do this. I had signed the deed on this building 14 months ago, in my name alone. And the lease they'd been operating under, the one for the event space and the offices and the studio on the 3rd floor, had a clause in it that most people never bother to read. They were about to try to buy me out of my own house. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we tell quiet, true-to-life stories about dignity, preparation, and the people who stopped making themselves small so someone else could feel large. If you've ever built something from nothing and watched someone try to put their name on it while you were still standing in the room, this one is for you. Drop a comment below, and be sure to subscribe. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what Celeste Harmon was to me before she became the woman with the cream envelope. And to understand that, you have to understand what it meant to grow up the daughter of Comfort Osei in the north side of a mid-sized city where your mother cleaned offices at night and did hair out of the kitchen on weekends and never once suggested that the ceiling above you is fixed. My mother had a saying she used whenever someone told her the realistic version of a thing. She would tilt her head and say, quietly, "Let's find out." Not as a challenge, as a method. She wasn't a loud woman. She was a precise one. She kept receipts for everything, not because she was suspicious by nature, but because she understood that the world sometimes needed proof, and that proof was something you assembled before you needed it, not after. I was 11 the first time I understood what she meant by that. My school held an entrepreneurship fair. You could enter a project and compete for a $50 prize and a certificate that nobody's parents would ever frame. I entered a beeswax lip balm I'd made from a YouTube tutorial and a $10 craft store kit. I sold out in the first 40 minutes. I made $62. The teacher who ran the fair told me afterward kindly that I had a good instinct for sales, but that I should think carefully about whether business was a realistic path for someone like me. I was 11. I didn't know exactly what she meant by someone like me. But I watched my mother's face when I told her, and I saw the particular stillness that came over her when she was deciding whether to be angry. She chose precision instead. She said, "What did you sell? How much did you charge, and what did it cost you to make it?" I told her. She did the math on the back of an envelope, wrote down my profit margin in red pen, circled it, and taped it to the refrigerator where it stayed for 3 years. That number wasn't a memory. It was a document. That's what it means to grow up in a house that keeps receipts. You don't carry wounds the way other people do. Open and wet, and available to anyone who wants to press on them. You carry evidence. Quietly, in a folder, until the moment someone needs to understand the full picture. By the time I was in college, I had run 4 small businesses, none of them remarkable, all of them instructive. I learned that I was good at 2 things above almost everything else. I could see what a space was supposed to become before it became it, and I could make people feel, in a room I had designed, that they had arrived somewhere that had been waiting for them. I didn't have a word for this yet. I would later learn that the industry called it experiential design. I called it making a room tell the truth. I graduated with a degree in interior architecture and 3 years of event coordination under my belt, and I went to work for a mid-sized firm that did corporate interiors and the occasional high-end wedding. I was good. I was promoted twice in 2 years. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, I sat across a desk from a senior partner who explained that they were restructuring the team and that my position was being eliminated and that they hoped I understood. I understood completely. I understood that I was the only person on the design team without a family connection to the founding partners, and that the restructure had been announced on the same week a partner's nephew had graduated from design school. I understood the math of it. I was not surprised, but I was finished with rooms that had been built by other people to fit other people's proportions. I walked out of that office and I called my mother. She said, "What do you have and what do you need?" I had $8,000 in savings, a client list I had built myself on nights and weekends, and a spare bedroom that could hold a desk, a drafting table, and a woman who had decided she was through being restructured. What I needed was a partner. Celeste Harmon and I had met 2 years earlier at a professional development workshop neither of us wanted to attend. She was working in event sales at a hotel downtown, tall and precise, with the particular competence of someone who had been underestimated professionally and had metabolized the experience into fuel. We had talked for 4 hours over bad conference coffee about the gap in the market, clients who wanted the intimacy and vision of a boutique design firm with the execution capacity of a full agency. There was nobody doing both well. We both knew it. We had laughed about starting something together and then gone back to our respective jobs and let the idea sit. When I called her after the Tuesday in March, she answered on the second ring. We spent 6 months planning. We divided the labor cleanly. I would lead design and creative vision. She would lead client acquisition and operations. We drew up a partnership agreement, 50-50, with an attorney neither of us had ever used before, and we signed it at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning with my mother's good coffee and 2 different colored pens, because Celeste had read somewhere that contracts looked more official when the signatures were in different ink. I tell you this because I want you to understand that in the beginning, Celeste was a real partner. She was organized and relentless, and she had a gift for making potential clients feel like they were about to be led into something exclusive. She sold the vision with complete conviction because in those early years, she believed in it as much as I did. The business grew. Not overnight and not without cost. There were 2 years of 18-hour days and a 3rd year where I paid both our salaries out of my personal savings for 4 months because a major client delayed a payment and I refused to miss payroll. I didn't tell Celeste about that last part until much later. I paid the 4 months and I kept the receipts and I told myself it was an investment. That's the thing about being a builder. You get so good at constructing the load-bearing walls that you forget to check whether the person standing next to you is holding any of the weight. By year 4, we had 14 full-time staff, a project list that stretched 8 months out, and a reputation that had started to travel past our city. And it was somewhere in year 4 that I began to notice the temperature change. The same kind I'd felt once before, in a restructuring meeting, sitting across from a man who had already made the decision and was performing the conversation. It started with small things. Celeste began copying Marcus on emails that had previously been just between us. She started introducing herself at industry events as the founder of Osei Harmon Design, without the Osei. It was always a correction she'd make smoothly if I was standing nearby. Co-founder, she'd add, with a laugh that meant to communicate I was being oversensitive for noticing. She began arriving late to client presentations. She began leaving early. She hired 2 people without consulting me, framing it as a surprise. "I just got so excited," she said, and smiled the way people smile when they've calculated that warmth will diffuse scrutiny. The 2 people she hired both reported directly to her. Neither of them had ever heard my name before their first day. And then Marcus started coming to the office. Not as legal counsel at first, just stopping by, bringing lunch, sitting in on meetings. He and Celeste had been married for 3 years by then, and I had always liked Marcus well enough. He was measured and careful and spoke in the complete sentences of someone who understood that words were binding. I liked him less when I started understanding which conversations he was sitting in on and what kind of notes he was taking. I didn't confront any of it. That's not how I work. Instead, I went home one evening and I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Celeste and I had signed the partnership agreement, and I did what my mother taught me. I asked 3 questions. What do I have? What do I need? What does the paper say? The paper said a lot. I pulled the partnership agreement, and I read it the way I'd never quite read it before, not as a founding document between colleagues, but as a legal instrument drawn up between parties who might one day have opposing interests. And it was in that reading, on a quiet Wednesday night, that I found the provision neither of us had paid much attention to in the optimism of a Saturday morning with good coffee. The buyout clause. 50-50 partnership, yes. But the buyout clause had a specific trigger. It could only be invoked if both parties agreed, or if one party could demonstrate a material breach of the partnership terms. It could not be used unilaterally. It could not be forced on an unwilling partner who had not breached. There were other things I found that night. In the company's operating documents, in the lease agreements, in the structure of the LLC. Because here's the thing about being the person who designs spaces for a living. I understand infrastructure. I understand that a beautiful room only works because of what's inside the walls. And the infrastructure of Osei Harmon Design had been built by me, on my credit with my relationships, in a building that I had, 14 months prior, purchased through a separate holding company I'd formed the year before we launched, because I had learned early that the land beneath a thing and the thing itself are different assets, and that keeping them separate was the kind of precision my mother would have called good sense. Marcus was a business attorney. He was competent, but he had only ever reviewed the partnership agreement, not the property records. And the property records were very clear. I did not call Celeste. I did not change my behavior at the office. I went to work the next morning and I was professional and present, and I designed a beautiful pop-up retail space for a client who needed to believe, walking into a temporary room, that she had arrived somewhere permanent. I had a meeting with my own attorney 2 weeks later. I brought a folder. I had been building it for 30 days. She read it quietly and said, "They're going to try to push you out." I said I knew. She said, "When?" I said, "The launch party. They'll want the room full. They'll want the optics of generosity. A public offer at a celebration. It reads like a gift. They're counting on me not wanting a scene." My attorney looked at me for a long moment. Then she asked, "What do you want to do?" I told her. She said she'd make 3 calls. The launch party had been in planning for 4 months. It was the firm's 5-year anniversary and our largest project to date. A full rebrand, a new studio space on the 3rd floor of the building, a client showcase that took over 2 floors. I had designed the event myself. Every detail of it. The lighting temperature, the flower variety, the order in which the portfolio pieces were revealed. I had written the evening's program and chosen the caterer and selected the music and arranged for the journalist. I had done all of this knowing by then, with a certainty I kept in a locked folder on my laptop, what Celeste and Marcus were planning to do with the evening I was building. I want you to understand something about preparation. People confuse it with vengeance. It isn't. Vengeance is reactive. It's built in the heat of being hurt. Preparation is something you do cold, methodically, the way you spec out the load-bearing elements of a building before you think about what color to paint the walls. I was not angry at Celeste that month. I was precise about her. There's a difference, and it matters, because anger makes you sloppy and precision makes you ready. My mother flew in 2 days before the party. She did not know the full shape of what was happening. I had told her only that I needed her there, that the evening mattered. She arrived with her good coat and a pound cake she'd made on Friday morning, and the quiet readiness of a woman who had spent 40 years keeping receipts and knew when her daughter was assembling something important. I also called Kwame. Kwame Asani had been my first real mentor, the architect who had taken me on as an intern the summer before my senior year and taught me the difference between a drawing and a document, between what a space looked like and what it could withstand. He was 61 now and semi-retired and had, over the past 5 years, watched Osei Harmon grow with the particular quiet pride of someone who recognized his own investment in a thing without needing to claim it. I had not told him about Celeste either. I had told him the evening was important and that I wanted him to see the studio, and he had said he would bring his wife and dress appropriately. There was one more person I called. A woman named Harriet Tsao, who ran the business journal that had sent a journalist. Harriet and I had met at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast 2 years earlier, and she had done something that night that I had not forgotten. A man at our table had spoken over me twice in 4 minutes, and Harriet had waited until he finished his second interruption, and then she had turned to me and said, in a voice that carried, "You were saying?" Not as a performance, just as an act of basic precision. I had liked her immediately. I had stayed in touch. I had, When I began to understand what was coming, invited her personally and told her that the evening might produce a story she hadn't planned to write. She said she'd come prepared. The party was everything I had designed it to be. The room was warm in the specific way I had intended, the lighting doing what good lighting does, making people feel more comfortable in their own faces than they usually do. The portfolio pieces landed. The clients laughed and lingered. The journalists circulated. My staff moved through the room with the ease of people who knew exactly what they were doing, because I had briefed them Tuesday and again Thursday and again that morning, because a well-run room doesn't happen by accident, and I was not leaving anything to chance. Celeste was radiant. That was the word. She wore a dress the color of a good Bordeaux, and she worked the room with the fluency of someone who had been preparing her own version of this evening for some time. I watched her, and I kept my breathing even, and I thought about the building beneath my feet and the deed in my attorney's files and the folder I had left with my mother for safekeeping, and I was fine. Marcus found me at the bar at 40 minutes in. He came alone, which told me they had choreographed this. Celeste would be visible, in conversation, appearing unconnected when the offer arrived. He had the cream envelope in his breast pocket. I could see the edge of it above his pocket square. He ordered a drink he didn't need, and then turned to me with the expression of a man who had practiced the next 2 minutes and believed the practice had made him natural. "Nadia," he said. "Big night." I agreed that it was. He said something about how far the firm had come, how much had been accomplished, how remarkable a trajectory. I let him talk. I am good at letting people talk. You learn more from the architecture of someone's speech than from anything they actually say, and Marcus was building, sentence by sentence, toward the envelope in his pocket. Then Celeste appeared at my other elbow. Not arriving, materializing, the way people do when they've been waiting for a cue. She looked at me with the expression she had also practiced, soft and almost apologetic, the look of someone about to deliver news they wish were different. "We wanted to do this tonight," she said, "because it felt right. To do it in the room. To do it with everyone here." She reached across and touched my arm once, the way you touch someone you are about to release from an obligation. "You've built something incredible, Nadia. And we think it's time for you to be free to build the next thing." Marcus produced the envelope. "It's a fair offer," he said. "More than fair. We had it independently appraised. You'd be fully bought out, the partnership interest, the brand, all of it." He said it the way a careful person says something they've rehearsed to sound spontaneous. "You could consult if you wanted. Your name stays on the legacy work. Your name stays on the legacy work." I have been in enough conference rooms to know that sentence. It is the sentence people say when they're trying to make erasure sound like a tribute. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Celeste, who was watching me with the careful readiness of someone waiting for a signature. I looked at Marcus, whose eyes kept going to the room around us, to the clients, the journalist, the potential witnesses to a gracious and uncomplicated transaction. I did not open the envelope. I set it on the bar beside my glass, and I looked at both of them, and I said, "I want to make sure I understand the offer. This is for my partnership interest." Marcus said yes. I said, "And the brand equity, the Osei Harmon name?" He said yes, that was included, that the valuation was comprehensive. I said, "And the operations, the client relationships, all of that passes to the remaining partner?" He said yes, precisely. I nodded slowly, the way I nod when I'm reading a structural drawing and something doesn't add up yet, but I haven't found the discrepancy. "There's one asset you haven't mentioned," I said. Celeste's expression shifted a degree. Just a degree. "The building," I said. A very particular silence arrived at that bar. "The lease," Marcus said carefully. "The terms are standard." "The lease," I said, "is between Osei Harmon Design LLC and Osei Property Holdings LLC. Do you know who holds Osei Property Holdings?" He knew. I could see the moment he knew. The color did not drain from his face the way it had from my mother's kitchen table stories of dramatic confrontations. It was more precise than that. It was like watching a man revise an equation he thought he had already solved. "Your buyout offer," I said, "purchases my half of the operating company. It does not purchase the building the operating company runs out of. And the lease." I took a sip of water, set it down. has a termination clause that activates in the event of a change in majority partnership control, which means the moment you complete this buyout, the lease terminates in 30 days. Type the word receipts below if you've ever been in a room where someone tried to take something that was already yours. And subscribe because the part you came for is about to happen. Celeste said my name, just my name, once, in a voice I had never heard from her before. Not the practiced warmth. Not the managed warmth. Something underneath both of those. I picked up the envelope and I held it for a moment. I thought about a Saturday morning and 2 different colored pens and a woman who had been, for 3 years, a real partner and a real friend, and the long, slow distance between that morning and this one. I thought about the 4 months of payroll I had covered from my own savings and never mentioned. I thought about the nephew who had taken my job at the firm where I used to work, and the teacher who had used the phrase someone like me, and my mother's red pen circling a profit margin on an envelope just like this one. I set it back on the bar without opening it. I'm going to go talk to my guests, I said. We can schedule a proper meeting with both our attorneys. There are some instruments you'll want to review before we discuss any transaction. I looked at Marcus. I'd suggest starting with the property records. I did not say it with satisfaction. I said it the way I would tell a client that their permits were filed incorrectly, as information, useful, delivered without drama, because drama is expensive and precision is free. Then I walked away. Across the room I had built, in the building I owned, toward a woman in a good coat standing beside my mentor, who was telling her something that was making her smile. I had almost reached them when I heard Celeste's voice rise. It didn't rise the way I expected. It didn't rise like anger. It rose like panic, which is a different thing and harder to watch. Nadia. And then again, louder. Nadia, this isn't what you think. The room didn't stop, but it tilted. The particular tilt of 300 people collectively deciding to pay attention to something while pretending they weren't. I turned around slowly. Celeste was crossing the floor toward me, and the Bordeaux dress that had looked like confidence 20 minutes ago looked now like a woman who had miscalculated the room. Marcus was still at the bar. He had his phone out. He was reading something on it, very carefully, the way you read a document when you have just realized there is more to it than you thought. You could have just told me you wanted out, Celeste said, and her voice had the terrible rawness of someone whose script had ended and who was speaking now without one. If you wanted to dissolve the partnership, there was a conversation to be had. You didn't have to do this in front of everyone. I looked at her. I waited until I was sure I had the calmest version of what I needed to say. Celeste, I said, you planned this in front of everyone. You chose the launch party, the full room, the journalist. I didn't gesture toward Harriet, but I could feel her 2 tables away, very still, listening with the attention of someone taking notes without writing anything down. I didn't bring anyone here that wasn't already on the guest list. I just made sure the people I needed were in the building. She opened her mouth and then didn't use it. I didn't come here to hurt you tonight, I said. I came here to open my studio, which is what I'm going to do. I looked at her for one more moment, long enough that she would know I meant it. Call your attorney Monday. Have her call mine. I turned back to my mother and my mentor and the room I had made. My mother took one look at my face and handed me a glass of water. Kwame said nothing. He had the expression of a man who has watched a building survive its first real test and wants to give the engineer a moment. My mother put one hand briefly on my shoulder and then let it go, because she has never been a woman who mistakes a shoulder for a resting place when a daughter is still standing up. Harriet Sow appeared at my side 20 minutes later, when the room had settled back into its correct temperature. She had her small notebook open. She had not been pretending not to take notes. I came for a profile, she said. I'm now thinking it's a longer piece. I told her I was available the following Thursday. She said that worked. Here is the part that is less satisfying to tell, because resolution in real life is never as clean as the moment at the bar, and I want to be honest with you about what happened after. Celeste and I met with our attorneys 6 days later. The meeting lasted 4 hours and was deeply uncomfortable in the particular way of conversations between people who once genuinely liked each other and are now sitting on opposite sides of a table. She had not known about the building. I had never hidden it, It was in the public records, but she had never looked because she had trusted me, and I understood that the trust and the ambition had been running alongside each other in her for a long time, and that she had not, perhaps, fully understood which one would win until it had already won. We negotiated for 6 weeks. I bought out her partnership interest at a fair valuation, the same number in the cream envelope, which I had eventually opened and found to be, as Marcus had said, reasonable. She left the firm. She took 2 of the people she had hired, which was her right, and she started her own practice, which I was told was going well a year later. I rebranded. The firm is called Disowned now. Not because I wanted her name off it, but because it had become, in the honest accounting of things, the more accurate name. The studio on the 3rd floor still runs events twice a month. Harriet's piece ran 8 weeks after the party. It was the longest profile the journal had published in 3 years. It said nothing about the cream envelope or the bar or the lease clause. It said a great deal about what it looks like when a woman builds something that can hold its own weight. My mother's pound cake never made it to the party. We ate it the next morning, at my kitchen table, with the same coffee she had always made, and she asked me the 3 questions she always asks. What do you have? What do you need? What does the paper say? I told her I had a building and a firm and a staff I trusted and a reputation I had earned. I told her I needed a good night's sleep. And I told her the paper said exactly what I had written it to say, which was what I had intended the day I wrote it. She nodded and refilled her cup. And from the countertop where I had propped it up the night before, a single document caught the morning light. Not the buyout envelope. Not the partnership agreement. The profit margin from a craft fair, 23 years old, on the back of an envelope in red pen. I had found it in a box when we moved to the new office, and I had brought it with me, without quite deciding to. My mother saw me looking at it. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Some documents don't need reading. They just need to be in the room. There are people who will come into your life and call themselves partners. Some of them are. Some of them are planners in partners' clothing, waiting for the right room, the right audience, the right cream envelope. The difference between those 2 kinds of people is not always visible on a Saturday morning with 2 different colored pens. Sometimes the only way to know the difference is to keep your own records, build your own infrastructure, and be, quietly, the person in the room who has already read the last page. If someone in your life is trying to buy you out of something you built, ask yourself one question before you open the envelope. Did they remember to read the property records? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.